Thank you very much for having me. I'm delighted to be here. Is that okay? Is that feedback? No. I'm delighted to be here and to see so many people interested in autism. The last time I was in India was in 2011 at the conference, and the crowd was about a fifth of the size of the delegates today. So I'm so pleased that the word is getting out there more and more. Okay. The word is getting out there more and more people are interested to hear what people are saying about autism and how we can help people with autism. Yesterday we heard a lot about children with autism and how we can help. And this morning it was really nice to hear how we can help adolescents with autism, and I was very impressed by the detail and by the points that were made about adolescents with autism and the importance of... are we okay? So my talk will focus on adults with autism, and I think that follows very nicely from the very interesting talk about adolescents we heard this morning, and I was very impressed with the very practical advice that was given, and I think that's very important to say that adolescents with autism are adolescents first of all, and they have a diagnosis with autism which makes adolescence even just that bit more difficult for some people. So in my talk today, first of all, I'll go back just a moment to talk about the definition and prevalence. Then we will be talking about adults' living arrangements and future planning, leaving school and employment, family and relationships, and finally I hope to make some recommendations for professionals and parents. And one of the things, I want to go back to the definition of autism. You know about the diagnostic manuals that are being used for autism, but it's important just to remind us what exactly are the diagnostic criteria that are being used. So let's just start with the DSM-5. There are two particular behavioral areas that are being assessed, and when they are present in the person for a prolonged period of time, then we get a diagnosis with autism, right? Now, I know everybody knows this, but it's also important to remind us, because we sometimes we assume that we know something when we actually, or that we're talking about the same thing when we're actually not. One thing that's really important to remember with autism, that it is a wide spectrum, that it covers a wide spectrum, and in the diagnostic manuals these days, they're talking about the level of support required rather than the disability. Another really important, so there are three levels of support. Somebody requires support, somebody requires substantial support, and somebody requires very substantial support. So always whenever we talk about autism, remembering that there are a whole range of the spectrum. And we don't always define that before we start talking about it. We just say somebody with autism, and then somebody says something, and we say, oh, but that's not the kind of autism I'm talking about. We're talking about a different kind of autism. So just remember that. And I'm trying, as my talk goes on, to span that spectrum and give examples from the full spectrum, but remind us which end of the spectrum, which what we're talking about. Another really important point is that there are no medical tests for autism, so we don't have a medical diagnosis. It's called a medical diagnosis, but it's not actually a physical medical diagnosis. When you have a Down syndrome, you know there's one of the genes is different and so forth. So there are medical tests that can be done to see this. But with autism at the moment, we don't have any medical tests. When it comes to the prevalence, we're talking about a whole range of different things. So I did some mathematics just for the sake of this audience here today. It's generally accepted that there's 2% of the children have autism. In the States, that when you take the population of the child population, I was looking it up, that means there's about 1.5 million kids in the United States with autism, if you go with the 2%. Now, I've done some research where it's actually much higher than that, but we'll just go with that. In the UK, that's the figures, and I did the population calculations for India, just by looking up how many kids are there in India, and that should be 6.5 million kids in India with autism on the full spectrum. When it comes to adults, I'm going to go with the 1% because we just don't have the figures, which is also already interesting to see that we have the figures for the kids, but we don't have the figures for the adults to the same extent. So that's quite interesting. But I just did an overall population calculation when you consider that that's the full population in the US, in the UK, and in India. That's how many people we could be talking about having autism. Okay, so that's a huge number of people. So it's an interesting phenomenon when you talk about, is autism a disability or is it a disorder? In the context of disability rights, autism is considered a disability rather than a disease or a disorder. So autism is not an illness. Sometimes people talk about, people suffering from autism as if it is an illness. It's not an illness. It's a disability. It affects the way you relate to your environment, but not in the way that an illness does. And the self-advocacy and people that on the higher level of functioning with autism, we find a lot of people are sort of saying, I'm autistic and I'm actually quite proud of it. I have got lots of skills that other people don't have. I can see things in the way that other people don't see things, and I can analyze. There's a powerful lobby of these people in the governments in the UK anyway. I can't speak for India, obviously, but they're talking about the autism rights and the autism culture. They sometimes identify themselves as a neurodiversity movement, and it's important to know that people are just saying autism is just a neurological difference. There's nothing wrong with being autistic. It's actually quite a good thing. We are very proud to be autistic. Now, that's people on one side of the spectrum, and I know that I just want to make sure that everybody is aware of that. That's been in existence. They view autism as a natural variation of the human brain. And they are talking about accepting, not changing autistic behavior. We've talked a lot about changing autistic behaviors today, yesterday. These people are saying that's really bad. We shouldn't be changing autistic people. We should be leaving them be. We should just accept them. And I don't think there's a dichotomy between the two things at all. Because if you have a child on the other end of the spectrum that has a lot of behavioral issues that need to be addressed, that is one way of accepting that child, by helping them to bring out the full potential of that child. So is autism lifelong? Because this talk is about adults with autism. So oftentimes we say, is autism lifelong? Because people are saying that it is. So I want to give you two examples. So without ABA-based interventions, this is what we see. There was a study done of 60 children with autism who attended special schools who did not have ABA-based interventions. And this study had a 40-year follow-up. In that 40-year follow-up, they found that 45, so that's 3/4 of those kids that were now adults, 40 years later, they're now adults, had the same IQ as they had when they were children, with some improvement in language. And 15, so that's 1/4 of this population, could not be assessed because they had not developed language above a 3-year-old level, and they had severe self-injurious and challenging behaviors. This was a study done by Patricia Howland, and she followed that up in 2004 and then again in 2014. And here I want to show you a little animation. I do hope it works. Just how this happens, that a child with challenging behavior turns into an adult with challenging behavior without any intervention. This is a little animation. Hopefully you'll have the sound. No, there's no sound. We tested the sound.
Slapping.
Oh, all right. There we have the sound. So this is a child with challenging behaviors, with self-abusive behavior.
If the behavior is not addressed, we can see here a possible scenario. The self-injurious behaviors can still exist through adulthood. By going back through time, we can see how this behavior may have developed.
So if these challenging behaviors are not addressed in early childhood, they can turn into very severe self-injurious behavior in adults. And that's really what we're looking for. So an alternative view is possible. Is autism lifelong with ABA-based interventions? And it's not a guarantee, obviously. But with ABA-based interventions, in the optimal outcome study that by Deborah Fine, she found that there was a significant difference between the children that had received ABA-based interventions, especially in the early years, between 2.5, 3.5. There was also a statistical significant relationship if they were a little bit older, And the improvements continue with this intervention throughout the lifespan, but the particularly important is the early intervention. Yesterday, Dr. Neil Martin already mentioned the LOVA study, which is obviously the historical study that we all refer to. But so I'm not going to go into that in great detail. But that study, in a university-based intervention, nearly half the children improved significantly. And in another study, 18% of the children diagnosed at the age of 2 receiving mostly behavioural interventions lost the diagnosis at age 4, which I think is quite interesting, because I always think if you had a child with a 2-year-old child that gets a diagnosis with a very experienced diagnostic team, a multidisciplinary diagnosis, so this is a real diagnosis, this child is autistic, and if you get the intervention right with this child, because autism is a behavioural definition, a behavioural diagnosis, if those behaviours change, and say at a 4-year-old or 7-year-old child gets to another diagnostic team, gets presented, the people are supposed to decide whether this child has a diagnosis with autism, and they don't see those behaviours because the behaviours have been addressed. This child doesn't behave like that anymore, or not significantly enough anyway. Does that mean that child is cured, that it's recovered from autism? Those terms are difficult terms, and we need to be careful when we use them. But I want to show you the difference from, I want to show you a young man who actually had very intensive early behavioral intervention. Now, we have an ethical code as a behavior analyst where we are not allowed to ask our own clients to give feedback, certainly not publicly. So what I did, I asked some other people, some other colleagues, some other behavior analysts, if they had a client who was no longer a client who would like to talk to me, so that they are not asking them personally, but I can ask them, so that we're not breaking any ethical codes. So this is a young man called Eli, who got fantastic early intervention by a really dear colleague and friend, Bobby Newman in New York. And Eli, we have a long video, but I'm only going to show you the first little bit of it. And you will see that Eli is an autistic adult, but just listen to him. Hold on.
Hi, I'm Eli Allen. I'm 20 years old, and I'm currently a student at Mitchell College. I'm first going to get my bachelor's in early childhood, get certification, but then I may eventually want to go to grad school, getting either a master or a doctor in ABA, and go more to a school psych route by doing, evaluations and working.
I'm not going to show the whole video. He's on YouTube, so you can all watch the rest of it. But you can see a young man who is clearly still on the spectrum because of the way he talks and everything else. But he's got ambitions, and I'm in touch with him quite a lot on Facebook and so forth. And he actually is training to become a behavior analyst himself, which is just great news. So what happens to people when they leave school? What kind of school qualifications do people with autism have when they leave school, like Eli Allen had? Now, we did a piece of research. Now, these data are all related to Northern Ireland, so because that's where we did the research, that's where I live. So when you look at the graph here, the blue is the highest level of school education, the good grades in the highest level, and it tells you here the percentage of students who left with the highest level of school education with A levels in the good grades. The red shows you the school leaving age at 16, that qualification that you get at 16. We call it GCSEs. I don't know what it's called in India. And the green shows students who leave school without any qualifications. So you can see the children with autism, there's quite a lot, nearly 70% leave without qualifications. Now, and these data were collected when we still had the diagnosis of Asperger's, so you can see that the children with Asperger's fare a little bit better. But you can see that when the typically developing children in the third column, they have mostly leave with at least some qualifications. So what happens to these children after they leave school? So here we have the data about what happens. Do they go to higher education, further education? Do they go into employment? Do they go into training? Or are they unemployed? Or do we just not know what happens to them? And again, you can see the blue is the children with autism, the red is the children with Asperger's, and the green are the children with no diagnosis. So you can see the difference that happens, that in terms of employment and training, there's quite a difference between these children. And what do they study when they go to college? So we just did the comparison. Do they study education and training? Do health, public services? This is an interesting graph because oftentimes we think that young people with autism are only interested in computers and they're computer nerds. They're not. Okay, they're interested in everything else as well, just like any other young person. Maybe they have a bit of a tendency to go towards computers, but don't just assume that. Okay, they're interested in everything else as well. So what happens when they then go from, I'm just flying through their life cycle here. What happens when they go to supported employment? There is a supported employment model that is used across Europe. Again, you need to check what's used in India, but it has 5 stages, and I think it's quite a useful model to use, where the first stage is just about engagement with young people, and this should really start in school and certainly in further training, where you focus on informed choices and accessibility. And then you do vocational profiling, where you focus on employment, where you sort of see what kind of skills does this young person have. And the job finding phase is particularly interested. The Dutch have a lovely term, they call it job carving. So don't be shy to go to an employer and say, I have a young person here who has such and such a skill. Will you have a job for them of some sort? So because our young people are often quite disadvantaged when it comes to interviewing skills. They don't do terribly well in job interviews. So if they can't respond to an advertisement, a job advertisement, if they fail the interview, well, go to an employer and say, well, listen, this person might only be able to work for 2 hours a day, but they have fantastic skills. Could you find a job for them? And that gets them started. We had a lovely workshop one time a while back, and the speaker asked, how many of you got their first job through a job advertisement? There was no hands go up. Our very first jobs are not usually gotten through job advertisement. They're usually gotten by our parents, help a bit, or some aunt has a shop or something, right? That's okay. That's okay. That's how we all get our first jobs. And then she said, what about your second job? How many of you got that through a job advertisement? A few hands went up. What about your third job? Most hands went up. Okay, that's the process of employment. Okay, so that's okay. So what kind of jobs do they do? Again, a whole range of different jobs. Okay, so a lot of retail, a lot of wholesale, some information technology, customer services. These are the data that we collected from samples in Northern Ireland. It might be slightly different, but what I'm wanting to say is that these people can be in all kinds of jobs. So don't pigeonhole them. We recently published a book for job coaches, which I think is quite interesting, and you can get it on Amazon, Job Coaches for Adults with Disabilities. We wrote that together with an international team of scholars. Here you see one of the scholars, that's Catherine. She is an adult with autism who was a co-author of the book. And she was a co-author of the project that led to the book. And there's a whole range of skills that job coaches need to be able to engage in. So the issues that arise from all of that is that fewer than 1 in 4 school leavers with autism stay in further and higher education, that at least 1 in 3 adults with autism experience severe mental health issues, and challenging behaviours are relatively common and increase the prevalence of those who have intellectual disabilities. So where do these people live? We're now getting more to the other end of the spectrum, because very often people with autism do need some help and some support. They don't necessarily become independent, especially the older population as we are at the moment. There is hope that maybe, as I said in the early slides, that in future it might get a little bit better, because the youngsters are getting better therapies now. They're getting ABA-based interventions, whereas in the past, those ones that are 40 years now probably didn't get that. So it depends really on the support needs, but it also depends on the preferences and choices and the local facilities and the finance. When you wonder where somebody wants to live, ask them. Ask them where they want to live. Don't just assume that because they have autism they need to live somewhere, whatever. I mean, nobody forced me to live in a certain place. Nobody forced you to live in a certain place. You have your own preferences where you want to live. We did a piece of research where we did a focus group with young people with disabilities, and some of them had autism, some of them had Down syndrome and other disabilities, intellectual disabilities. And one of the young girls said, you know, we were talking about where you want to live and independent living and so forth. And she says, you know, I would like to move out, but I don't think my mom is just ready yet, which was quite nice. You know, it's a whole family approach. Transitions can take a longer time. You need to help a little bit, but you do need to have future planning. There's about 4% of the people with autism, and this is where I come back to the spectrum, live independently, with or without a partner or with their own children. Don't forget, adults with autism get married, have children, just the same as the rest of us. Some of them are able to do that. Some of their kids don't have autism, some of their kids do have autism. That's because we know there's a genetic link, but we don't know exactly how much of it is linked and whether it's just a vulnerability. So 4%. But 30% of adults with autism live semi-independently in group homes and sheltered housing. But the vast majority of adults with autism live with their aging parents. So I want to talk a little bit about yourselves as aging parents as well, because you might have your children might be very young at the moment, but they will get older, and you will look after them. So we did some research on aging caregivers in Northern Ireland, and here's just the figures for Northern Ireland, which is obviously, if you multiply that to India, you have to add an extra couple of zeros to all of the figures here. But the vast number of people that provide unpaid care for people with autism, the caregivers, who are they? Half of them are over 50 years of age, and 5% are actually over 75 years of age. So parents care for their adult children into their late age. We published a paper called 40 years is an awful long time, because that was a quote of one of the parents. They care for that length of time. A quarter of them provide care for more than 50 hours a week. In India, we don't really know the figures. We know that there's a culture of caregiving in India, there's a culture of extended families. But again, the move towards more nuclear families makes that more difficult as well. So you have, generally speaking, at least one of the parents given up a job to look after the child with autism, who then turns into an adult. But the exact numbers is not known. Here are two quotes of the people that we interviewed for the research, who were saying, you see, when Johnny was given to us, he was a normal child. Then a year later, the pediatrician tells us, you look after him until he's 5 years old, if he survives that long. He's 40 years old, and we are thankful for that. But 40 years is an awful long time to look after your child. Another parent, which I think was really getting to us, is the thing is that we are getting older. We think, what if anything happens to us? And I hear that all the time. My daughter says, oh, Mommy, don't worry, I look after Billy. Of course, that's not their real names. But I don't want her to. The parents don't want their siblings to, their other children to look after because that was a life that I had. I don't want my daughter to have the same life caring for him. And then the parents said, I hope God takes him before us. Imagine a parent wishing that on their child because they're so worried about what might happen to their child after they're gone. It just absolutely cracks me up. It breaks my heart. So we have a vast majority of the adults with autism living in the community. We have the caregivers of 20% of these adults being over 70 years of age, and the unpaid caregiving. In fact, in the UK, the unpaid caregiving, if you had to pay for it, it would cost the same as the whole of the National Health Service altogether again. Right? It would be double the cost of the National Health Service. That's how much unpaid care is worth. And of course, they have financial hardships and they have social isolation. They have, but on the other hand, the caregivers have told us that they enjoy the time with their son and daughter. They love it, although they do find it challenging. They get some support from the families, but and a little bit of support from the friends and neighbours. The interesting thing was also, we asked the aging caregivers, what about your own health? How are you doing? You know, and they all said, oh, we're all right, we're fine, you know. But when you ask them, well, do you suffer from arthritis? Do you suffer from these different, you know, age, like the kinds of things that happen when you get older? They were saying, oh, yeah, we do have that. But they said, we're fine, you know, so they put their own needs right behind. I'm rushing through this because I want to show you a video of a family. One of the key things from this research came out that they 70%, over 70% had no plans for what will happen. This is one of the messages I want you, as parents of younger children or adults, to take home with you. Do make plans. You know, that the day will come, and maybe the young persons with autism have a right also to live independent lives, or you know, as independent as possible. But who of you lived with their parents when they're 30 or 40? Maybe some, but you know, there's always this bachelor son that stays at home. But most of us didn't. So why would we expect a person with adult to want to live with their parents that long? So don't, you know, that we need to not feel bad about allowing them to move out, because that's important. But here's an Irish family with their child, and it's pretty heart-wrenching. But I want you to see it.
Listen upstairs, there's Uncle Poirot
Not
in
very often you
the
get into the
murder
family home.
mystery in Alpha Christie's. Deaths on the Nile.
Charlie is 32 and has autism. His parents have cared for him all his life, but are now older and less able to cope. So Charlie will soon need a full-time residential place. His parents are increasingly worried about where he's going to end up.
If you speak very fast to him, he doesn't understand it. He likes peace. And he doesn't like to be disturbed.
Give me that.
What he does every day, he wants to do it every day. And to break that routine is quite a job.
50 pegs, yes, 50 pegs. Blue, yellow, green, white and red.
As part of his autism, Charlie has a very strict routine and becomes distressed if anything changes. It could take him some time to adjust to a residential place, so it's important that the coolies find somewhere suitable for him. Charlie's distress still upsets his mother.
You can't tell you that he's upset like you are. He lets all his frustration out by shouting out. And he'll probably go into the bathroom or into a room alone. Let him get all that shouting and get all that out of him. What do you think now, after years of use? Want your tea, Johnny?
Yes.
You
all right?
You okay now?
Both Charlie's parents are in bad health. His father has diabetes and heart disease. Anne has osteoporosis and needs a hip replacement. Looking after Charlie is increasingly taking its toll.
Push in there now. I'll just lie outside here for a while. Rest myself.
The family spend most afternoons in bed.
I'll fix your pillow now there. These days I'm so exhausted. I just want to go into bed, cover myself up and forget that I'm alive. You know, under your head, Charlie?
Yes.
You sure?
Sure.
I don't think you won't understand it. Understand what it's like. It makes you hard. It makes you feel well. Everybody's living their own lives. And you're there. You know, you have to stick to that work. No, tonight.
Charlie does get services. He attends a day centre.
I don't want to run over time too much because there's another speaker coming, but I think this is why I was pointing out about the spectrum, because this is obviously on the other end of the spectrum. So if somebody tells me that he's proud to be autistic, I have a problem with that, because I think you don't want to take anything away from this young man, but you want to add to it. You want to add skills to this. This young man obviously didn't have any ABA-based interventions when he was a young child. We want to be able to add to those skills. We want to help him to be closer to be able to cope with all of this. And the distress of the parents just cracks me up each time. So I have some recommendations, and I'm going to rattle through them very quickly. Look after yourselves as parents. Carers need to look after their own health. They need some social and emotional support. They need family relationships. Get some sleep, get some rest if you can. Help each other out on this. Invest in your own health, nutrition, exercise, all of those things, especially when your kids are young. Don't forget about yourself. Find a place to vent. You know, if you cry, if you have to. Laugh if you have to, if you want to. Laugh out loud, celebrate more often. And let go sometimes. I mean, look after yourselves. And very, very importantly, if you're in a relationship, in an adult relationship, I don't mean necessarily marriage, but if you have a relationship, if you have a significant other adult, support each other and spend time, nourish that relationship. Importantly, I know I'm done. Importantly, look for the future as well. Plan for the future. Don't let it just happen, because when you're not able to look after your loved one, your son or daughter, when they become adults, and it becomes a crisis point, don't expose them to that crisis, because we've heard how difficult transitions are for these people very often. So plan for it. Get them used to staying away for one night, staying away for an afternoon for a couple of hours without you. If that's possible, allow that to happen. And if it's not possible, sit in the background. Allow them to socialize themselves as best possible. Give them the skills to do that. And then plan forward. Ease them into it. Because if you can't cope for them, if you have an accident or you become sick, they're going to be placed somewhere to be looked after. And that's going to be a huge shock for them. So if you plan forward, they're not exposed to that shock. So just as far as future care planning is concerned, there's all of those things together make the difference. So thank you very much.